Good morning, everyone. So glad that everyone has joined us today for what I believe is going to be a very interesting and thought-provoking conversation. So we'll jump straight into it. This morning we have Dr. Johnny Finn, who is an associate professor of geography at in the Department of Sociology, Social Work, and Anthropology at Christopher Newport University. And I'm just going to share a couple of things about his research, which focuses on the geography of race and racism in the Americas, and that he has conducted extensive field research in Brazil, Cuba, and in Hampton Roads, Virginia. And his current project, entitled Living Together, Living Apart, Geography of Segregation in the 21st Century, uses oral history interviews, historical analysis, participant-directed photography, and spatial analysis to better understand the ongoing human impacts of persistent racial segregation. Finn has also published over 30 research articles, book chapters, reports, and op-eds. Has attracted over $170,000 in research grants funding, and has given more than 25 invited lectures across North America, Latin America, and Europe. And in 2019, Dr. Finn became the editor-in-chief of the award-winning peer-reviewed Journal of Latin American Geography. At Christopher Newport University, Finn teaches courses in human geography, urban geography, human environment interaction, field research methods, and Latin American studies. And I'm so thrilled and pleased that Dr. Finn said yes to sharing with us today, and to know that we have such a resource and wealth of knowledge on this topic right here in our backyard. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Finn.
Well, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Am I clear? Clearly?
Yes.
Excellent, thanks. Well, it's absolutely wonderful to be here. Thanks for the very kind introduction. It's lovely to see so many people on the call today. I do have a presentation. I've shared out my slides, so hopefully you can see them right now. And I'll have a presentation that, like the title describes, and I believe like was in the material that has been circulating for the last couple of weeks. It kind of looks equal parts looking backward at the history of racial segregation in American cities particular, and then kind of looking into the present day and beyond, especially in terms of what are the ongoing impacts of this history right here in Hampton Roads. And so I'm going to jump back and forth a little bit between the national picture and the local picture, because at the end of the day, what's happening here in Hampton Roads is really a local manifestation of national processes that have been unfolding over the last 100 to 150 years. So the title of the talk is really Segregation in the 21st Century, again, because we're focusing especially on how our history impacts in an ongoing way our urban reality today. So let me just start at a broad scale here, looking specifically at the kind of the national scale. After the 2010 census, and I know they're gearing up to do this again once the 2020 data become available, some demographers at the University of Virginia created what they call the racial dot map. And it's an electronic, digital, interactive map what you can zoom in and out of. And this map actually has 310 million dots on it, each one color-coded for race. And as you zoom into different cities, you can really start to see at the block level how even in a place like New York City, where we think of this as an incredibly diverse, multicultural, multiracial, multilingual city, at the end of each day, quite literally, we return to neighborhoods in blocks and apartments and houses that are mostly populated by other people that look an awful lot like us. You can see this in Chicago, measured statistically, one of the most segregated cities in the country. You can see this in Detroit with a strong kind of north-south 8-mile road, this line between the city of Detroit and the more suburban and white county to the north. And you can see it right here in the Hampton Roads area on the peninsula, and also down in Norfolk and surrounding areas. I'm going to turn on my laser pointer real quick. Yeah, perfect. So you can really see how, even though our population density in this region isn't quite as dense as, say, Chicago or New York, we do still see these kinds of lines of racial segregation emerging. And so for this talk, I really want to kind of think through on the premise that there's nothing accidental or coincidental or kind of natural about our segregated urban landscapes. These landscapes were produced and they have consequences. And so what I really want to think through today is, how did it get this way first? What are the ongoing impacts and consequences in the second place? And third, I'll kind of conclude and open up for a discussion at the end of the talk about kind of how we can be thinking about resolving this issue, what we can think about kind of in the future, what can we do to fix this problem? And so, let's get right to it. How did it get this way? Like I said in the previous slide, it didn't get this way by accident. Racial segregation in American cities was made, and it was largely made through federal governmental segregationist housing policies dating all the way back to the early 20th century. So right here, what you're looking at on the screen is the kind of infamous redlining map for Hampton Roads, for Greater Norfolk, as it was called. And so you can see in the bottom 2/3 of the map is Norfolk and some parts of Portsmouth in present-day Chesapeake. And the top kind of third of the map is Hampton and Newport News. And then this little inset map over here, for those of us who are up here on the peninsula, this little inset map is actually Hilton Village. And so you should go up the James River several miles up, and this is kind of the inset of Hilton Village brought down onto this map. And these maps, rather than actually mapping out the specific lines of segregation, these maps were what were called security maps. They were produced largely in the second half of the Great Depression, so in the late 1930s. And the government, was part of the New Deal, was getting ready to pump a lot of resources to protect homeowners from foreclosure through favorable refinancing deals, through through government-backed mortgage insurance, and so on. And so these maps really were used to map out which neighborhoods were worthy of this kind of government-backed assistance to protect homeowners from foreclosure. And so you can think of it almost like a credit report, but for a neighborhood rather than for an individual. And it would say neighborhoods, and on the map in green, and the first grade, were most favorable, most deserving of these favorable terms for refinancing and for government-backed insurance. In blue, it was the second grade, and all the way down through yellow and into red, these infamous red lines neighborhoods, which would be kind of not able to receive this government assistance. And for every single neighborhood on this map, in Greater Norfolk, the map has 96 different neighborhoods, and every single neighborhood has a data sheet. And that data sheet has a whole lot of quantitative data at the top about the population who lives there, about the race and ethnicity of the population that lives there, about the housing stock, about incomes. And they also have a description of the characteristics of the area, a kind of a qualitative description. So this is the data sheet from the Old Wythe neighborhood in the city of Hampton. And you can see that just like for the green, the highest ranked neighborhoods, there were also descriptions, both with quantitative data at the top and also the qualitative description at the bottom for redlined neighborhoods as well. I had one of my student research assistants did a really interesting project where she did a qualitative kind of textual analysis of all 96 data sheets from all of these different 96 neighborhoods that were classified according to this map. And what she saw that popped out really importantly was the language, the qualitative language that was used to describe redlined neighborhoods versus the qualitative language that was used to describe the highest ranking, or these A-grade green neighborhoods. And so here's some of the representative language that Dominique, one of my research assistants, kind of used to pull out That was representative language used to describe A-rated neighborhoods. Construction is sound, the population is stable, streets are being improved, schools and churches are convenient. This is the best residential section of Norfolk, municipal golf court adjacent to the south. And you see a lot through here, a certain level of pride of home ownership. They talk a lot about how these neighborhoods, these green neighborhoods, exhibit high levels of pride of home ownership. And when you flip to representative language used to describe D neighborhoods or redlined neighborhoods, not only do you see kind of coded language like no pride of home ownership is available, but you also see a lot of overtly racist language come out in terms of these qualitative descriptions. In the end, even though these maps, these data sheets collected all kinds of different data, everything from income to housing stock, to occupation of the population, to these qualitative descriptions, at the end of the day, almost all white neighborhoods escaped being redlined, and every single Black neighborhood was redlined. That is to say, race became the determining factor in whether a neighborhood got the higher 3 classifications or whether it was redlined. And so in a certain sense, this is a way, one of the earliest ways that the US government, and through formal housing policy at the federal level, began to protect the wealth of white homeowners while blocking the protection of wealth of Black homeowners. In a project that I've recently been doing with the Virginian pilot, this is a map that I built for the pilot on this series that they're doing called the Dividing Line series. And this is a digitization of that redlining map. And just to give a sense, this map was made in 1940. Census data from 1940 mappable is a little bit problematic, but what I did is I overlaid the redlined polygons here. You can see these little redlined outlines. I overlaid that with census data from 1950, so just a decade later. And what you could see is that almost clinically, every single African-American neighborhood in the city of Norfolk was redlined. Now, not all redlined neighborhoods were predominantly African-American. Some redlined neighborhoods were kind of lower class or lower working class white neighborhoods as well. And if you get out into other cities around the country, there were redlined neighborhoods also included neighborhoods with high concentrations of recent immigrant populations, for example. But in the case of Norfolk, in the case of Greater Norfolk, of all of Hampton Roads, every single Black neighborhood was redlined. And this is not something that is unique to Hampton Roads. Almost 250 different cities around the country were redlined between 1936 and 1940. This is part of the racial history of this country that informs and kind of produced the racial geography that we experience today. At the same time, following World War II, so if you kind of fast forward from here about 10 or 15 years into the mid to late 1940s and early 1950s, there was a broad national housing shortage, and the U.S. put into place several different kind of policies designed to build out housing. And one of them was the really rapid build out of public housing. And generally speaking, public housing in the US followed what's known as a composition rule in this era, that is public housing in white neighborhoods would be segregated white, public housing in Black neighborhoods would be segregated Black. But the rub was that almost all public housing was built in primarily Black neighborhoods. And so almost all public housing built in this early post-war period was segregated Black and built in the soon-to-be kind of deindustrializing urban cores of many American cities. So through these two processes, these two federal policies of building segregated public housing and also the previous policy of redlining neighborhoods in order to protect white neighborhoods from foreclosure while not protecting Black neighborhoods, these were, in a certain sense, these are two housing policies that really served to block the accumulation or even erase the accumulation of Black wealth through housing. Then on the flip side of it, this is a map of Algonquin Park. This map is from 1909. You can see the date down here. The north arrow is to the left. So it's a curved, it's a tilted map. But this is a map of when Algonquin Park, a fairly elite neighborhood in Norfolk, was developed in the early 19th century. And every single one of these houses that was being developed by a single developer, every single one of these properties included a deed that looked like this. Now, if you zoom in on it, you'll see that this is in the year 1909. This is what's called a racially restrictive covenant. It is mutually understood and agreed and covenanted by and between parties hereto as follows. First, that for a period of 20 years from the 1st of August, 1909, the said property shall not be sold, leased, given, or devised to a person of African descent or to a corporation, a majority of whose stock is owned or controlled by a person or persons of African descent. Just a couple blocks away in the development of Fairmont Park, also in Norfolk, just a couple of miles to the southeast from Algonquin Park. This is an area that was developed with hundreds of properties. This is one page of a 2-page spread map of every single property. This map, as you can see, was made in 1904. 15 years later, in 1919, they were still selling properties from this development with almost the identical language of the racially restrictive covenant. I picked these two because they're quite representative, but I'm working with a title abstractor to pull these from courthouse records. It took the experienced title abstractor that I'm working with about 30 seconds to find these two racially restrictive covenants. That is to say, they're everywhere. This is the relic of this history in the U.S. And if you fast forward from the 19 teens up until the post-war years, while the U.S. government, through HUD, through Housing and Urban Development, was building out mostly segregated Black public housing, the Federal Housing Administration was building out mostly segregated white suburban developments. This famous suburban development out on Long Island called Levittown. There are actually 7 different cities in the U.S. named Levittown. And there's Levittown, New York. There's Levittown, Pennsylvania. There's even Levittown, Puerto Rico. These were all developed by William Levitt, a property developer, a residential property developer. There's no way he could have afforded to build 16 or 17,000 units out on Long Island in this period. He simply wouldn't have had the capital. And so he took a major loan from the FHA, and the FHA actually required him in this loan and the loans for the other Levittowns and for properties and developments being built all over the country by a whole wide assortment of developers. The FHA required that Levitt and other builders and other developers include that kind of racially restrictive covenant that I just showed in the last couple of slides. And so when you see an advertisement like this one, these are for some inner suburban homes suburban homes in the inner ring suburbs of the city of St. Louis from this period, you see kind of coded language about close to modern schools, churches, shopping, surrounded by fine homes in a healthy suburban atmosphere. It feels kind of coded to me. But when it says that these homes are FHA financed and FHA approved, that actually, in a very real and literal sense, that means that these neighborhoods will be whites only because they wouldn't have received FHA financing or FHA approval without including these racially restrictive covenants that barred African American families from purchasing these homes. And so we see that throughout kind of the middle half of the 20th century, the federal government played a really important role, not only in segregating American cities, but also in doing so, protecting white wealth through home ownership, while blocking at best and destroying at worst Black wealth also through home ownership. That is not to say that there weren't lots of other factors involved. You can look at blockbusting, discriminatory zoning, racial steering by realtors, contract lending, and other predatory lending schemes that took money from Black homebuyers. Interstate highway construction played a role. Overt racial violence. All of these things played a role in kind of maintaining and and producing really disparate outcomes for different people in different communities based upon the core, the structure of these federal housing policies that in effect segregated American cities. I should say I've gone kind of fast through this so that I can get onto what are the ongoing impacts in the present day. I teach a course on urban geography and urban sociology, and what I've just done here is like 2 weeks worth of course material. So forgive me for moving fast through it, and I'm happy to kind of be in touch with folks or follow up any of this in the Q&A or beyond. So please feel free to get in touch with me. But I do want to move on in terms of thinking about, okay, so that's how it got that way. It got that way because it was made that way. It got that way because the federal governmental housing policies made it this way, along with the actions of realtors, of banks, of builders, and so on. But what I want to know is kind of what are the ongoing impacts? What are the ongoing consequences? So I've tried to get at this question in my research in two ways, looking at, on the one hand, the macro or kind of structural impacts in the present day, and on the other hand, the embodied or individual impacts. And so to look at the embodied or individual, one thing that we've done is we've been recording dozens, if not now over 100 oral history interviews with people from all over the area to better understand kind of the human experience of growing up, of continuing to live in segregated neighborhoods, in the bottom left corner, of teaching in segregated schools, and so on. And so I'm not going to talk too much about this part of the research today, but I do invite you to visit our project's website. The web address is down here at the bottom of your screen. And that's where you can see a gallery of these portraits, and you can see excerpts from the oral history interviews that we've done with these individuals. On our website, you can also see this interactive map where we've distributed cameras to participants and asked participants to shoot pictures of places that are meaningful to them in their life. And then we've interviewed those participant photographers about the images, about the pictures that they took. And so on our project website, you can also see a gallery of these participant directed photographs, along with excerpts from interviews about the individual photos there. And taken together, I think this gives a pretty good kind of sense of the ongoing embodied and individual human impact of living in 21st century segregated neighborhoods. But for the rest of the talk today, what I really want to focus on is kind of these more macro level or structural impacts of ongoing racial segregation in American cities. I'm going to focus in particular in three different areas. First is in terms of racialized wealth inequality, racialized educational inequality second, and I'll conclude by turning to have a look at kind of environmental and human health inequalities, which is particularly relevant. It always has been relevant, but is particularly relevant now in terms of COVID-19, not only in the disparate impacts of the virus and the disease, but also the inequality and how the vaccine rollout is coming. So let's look at these three. A question that I get a lot, and I hear a lot, that commenters on posts and commenters on articles that I write frequently say is, well, we passed the Fair Housing Act now over 50 years ago in April of 1968. So next month, it'll be 53 years ago that Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act that made discrimination in housing illegal. And the question oftentimes follows is, why does it matter today? Why are we still talking about this today? If we're segregated, it's because people choose to be that way. It's kind of, we have this freedom of choice. There's no discrimination. And so any segregation that we have today is essentially self-segregation. And that ignores the fact that when you have governmental policies for 50, 60, 70, 100 years that not only segregate neighborhoods, but also generate and protect wealth for one group of people and block the generation and accumulation of wealth for another group of people, that has impacts that last long beyond the actual signing of the Fair Housing Act. So the most direct and immediate ongoing present day impact of our segregationist history is what's known as the racial wealth gap. And so if you look at here, on the left-hand side, this is the income gap. This is the gap between the median Black family in the US and median white family in the US in terms of the annual salary. But when you actually look at the total net worth of the median Black family and the median white family, already the racialized income gap is already a problem of a 60%, or excuse me, about a 40% gap between the median Black family and median white family in terms of annual income. But that's nothing compared to the 90% gap between median Black family wealth of about $17,000 total net worth and the median white family wealth of 10 times that amount, about $171,000. This is according to the Federal Reserve 2016 survey of consumer finances. And the reason for this racial wealth gap is simply that white families had opportunities to buy homes when they were cheap in the early to mid 20th century. And those homes, for example, the homes in Levittown and Long Island, when they were purchased in 1947 and 1948, they cost about twice national median income. And today, those homes sell for $500,000 to $600,000, which is almost 10 times national median income. And so the actual property itself accumulated, or has over the last 50 to 70 years, tremendously accumulated in terms of its value. And so the people who bought in when it was cheap and were able to keep that value, have it accumulate over their lifetime, accumulate generationally as they leave their homes or bequeath the wealth generated through those homes to their families, that builds up not only over an individual's lifetime, but generationally, to get to a point where today, the median, and median just means that 50% of families have more and 50% of families have less. The median white family wealth is 10 times median Black family wealth. And there's no explanation for this other than the ongoing remnants of discriminatory and outright racist housing policies in our past. In Hampton Roads, what this looks like is I've done some maps, and I'll try to walk you through because there's a lot going on in these maps. On these two maps side by side show the exact same area. It's a dot map that I created. It's one dot per person, color coded by race. So blue dots is one dot per white person, orange dots is one dot per Black person, and so on according to the key that you can see here. And on the left-hand map, I've overlaid the top two, the green and blue layers from the redlining map. And on the right-hand side, the right map, I've showed you the redlined neighborhoods. And so the data on this map is from 2018. And the redlined polygons, the redlined areas, are from 1940. So there's almost an 80-year gap between when these red lines were drawn and the racial geography today. And what we see is that the neighborhoods that were redlined 80 years ago are still predominantly African American. They have higher poverty rates. So here, the brighter red on the map here are higher poverty rates. You can see that the neighborhoods that were redlined 80 years ago today have significantly higher poverty rates. And neighborhoods that were redlined 80 years ago today still have significantly lower property values. And this is for the median family in the US. The one home that you own and live in is the majority of the wealth that you possess. Most of us don't have 2 or 3 or 4 homes. We don't have yachts. We don't have massive stock portfolios. We have the home that we own and live in, and then perhaps some retirement savings. This is where the middle class wealth lies. And what you can see is that neighborhoods that were redlined that are still today predominantly Black with higher poverty rates have significantly lower property values than homes that escaped redlining in our past. And so that's kind of the most direct connection from past to present in terms of what you're looking at. And I will just point to this one anomalous neighborhood here, this neighborhood that was redlined in 1940, that today has the median home value is over $500,000. And that's a neighborhood in part of Ghent in Norfolk, which in the 1950s and 60s underwent kind of the removal of a majority Black population and has undergone some kind of classic processes of gentrification since then that have turned a formerly redlined neighborhood into a really upper income, predominantly white neighborhood that it is today. So at this point, if we think about well, here are the economic impacts in the present day of our segregationist past. And then we think about, well, how do we populate our public schools and how do we fund our public schools? We populate our public schools based on neighborhoods, and we fund our local schools, our public schools, based on local property taxes. And so it should be, based on this map, in this history, it should be absolutely no surprise that there's a $23 billion per year racial funding gap between schools that are primarily white and schools that are primarily Black. This is a report from about a year ago in the Washington Post. Well, the Washington Post was reporting on the research that was done by others. The funding gap is largely the result of reliance on property taxes as a primary source of funding for schools. Communities in overwhelmingly white areas tend to be wealthier, and school districts' ability to raise money depends on the value of local property and the ability of residents to pay higher taxes. Overwhelmingly white school districts receive $23 billion more than predominantly non-white school districts in state and local funding in 2016, despite serving roughly the same number of children. So this is $23 billion more going to predominantly white than predominantly non-white schools year after year after year. So that's a kind of a secondary impact. Recently, in the last, I would say 10 or so years, there's been also in environmental research and environmental geography, a really interesting kind of confluence of thinking through environmental justice in the context of racial justice. And so this landmark study that is on the left here looks at Baltimore and compares the redlining map of Baltimore to a whole host of different environmental impacts, environmental justice concerns, air pollution, lead poisoning, and so on. On the right-hand side, this is a paper that was just written and published last year in the early 2020. Jeremy Hoffman is the chief scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia, and he and his co-authors looked at urban heat and the urban heat island effect and how that impacts redlined neighborhoods compared to non-redlined neighborhoods. And Jeremy's and his co-author study actually made in August of just last year, this past August, made the front page of the New York Times, looking at the impact of urban heat in Richmond overlaid with Richmond's redlining map. I happen to know Jeremy. I asked him if he would share his data with me so I could recreate these maps for Hampton Roads. And sure enough, what we find are redlined neighborhoods, neighborhoods that were redlined 80 years ago, today have significantly lower levels of tree canopy and significantly higher levels of impervious surfaces. And this is what drives urban microclimates. In areas with high levels of impervious surfaces suck up solar radiation all day long and hold on to it for longer. It's like heating up a frying pan on your stove. Even when you cut off the heat, the frying pan stays hot. And tree canopy and other green surfaces have the opposite impact of cooling neighborhoods off. And in Hampton Roads, formerly redlined neighborhoods, according to Jeremy Hoffman and his colleagues' studies, formerly redlined neighborhoods in Hampton Roads are about 5.5 degrees hotter on summer afternoons than neighborhoods that received the highest ratings on that original redlining map. And this has really significant impacts, especially for low-income populations. We saw how these redlined neighborhoods overlay with poverty rates. For low-income populations that probably live in substandard housing with substandard insulation, with single-pane windows, with inefficient air conditioning systems, this can very quickly a 5.5 degree Fahrenheit temperature difference is a really serious health concern when you go just block by block. The difference between this neighborhood in Titustown and this neighborhood, it's the green neighborhood right here in Algonquin Park, having just literal walking distance and a 5.5 degree temperature difference on a summer afternoon can lead to really profound health impacts. Another one that we've looked at in an analysis that I'm working on with a scientist from the Union of Concerned Scientists up in DC is the proximity to toxic release inventory sites. These are EPA sites where there's a high level of toxicity going from the shipyard or the coal terminal or other industry into air, ground, or water. And you can see that high poverty and high minority neighborhoods are overrepresented within 1 mile of toxic release inventory sites. And when you take into the combination the fact that, for example, in Southeast Newport News, not only are these populations within a mile of one TRI site, they're within a mile of 29 distinct toxic release inventory sites, or in Berkeley and Compostela, within a mile of 20 distinct toxic release inventory sites. And this is precisely right down here where they're about to start construction on a brand new natural gas fired power plant at the naval shipyard down there. That's again in the midst of high poverty, high minority neighborhoods and high poverty, high minority census tracts. Another dimension of this that we've looked at is the impact of interstates. And I don't want to go into too much methodological detail here, but another analysis that we did was look at what's the population within 500 meters of the interstate highway system in Norfolk. And we found, once again, that high minority populations and high poverty populations are overrepresented within that kind of 500-meter buffer where air quality is lower, where sound pollution is higher, and so on. And then the same thing, we've run another analysis looking at food deserts. And we found, again, not surprisingly, that high poverty, redlined neighborhoods tend to be the locations of modern day food deserts. This grocery store right here in Norfolk has since closed down. Since I made this map, the Save-A-Lot that was right here closed down. So this food desert around St. Paul's is actually significantly larger today than it was even when I made this map. And again, you can see how that breaks down the food desert population compared to the whole metro in general. And then I'm almost done with my slides, and I appreciate your patience as I move through these. But people have, especially medical researchers, have started making clear connections between our history of racist housing segregation, segregationist policies, the environmental impacts, and then the health impacts. And I'll just point to one, and I'll plug again this series of articles that the Pilot has just published over the last several weeks. It's called the Dividing Line series. It's published in the Virginian Pilot or at pilotonline.com. And I didn't write the series, but I did all the maps and the data analysis for the journalist who wrote this series. And what you can see here, this is probably, this is just a screenshot from the maps that we've published on the Pilot's website. And you can look and you can explore, you can zoom in on this map to see life expectancy, health insurance, diabetes rates, asthma rates, and so on. But I just want to point, by way of conclusion, I want to point to two neighborhoods that are literally side by side. This neighborhood in downtown Norfolk, Waterside area has a life expectancy well above the citywide average of about 75. Life expectancy of the census tract of the population that lives in this neighborhood of downtown Norfolk is almost 85 years. Literally the next census tract over, life expectancy in that census tract is almost 24 years lower at 61 and a half years. This is the neighborhood, the southern part of what's called, in the context of Norfolk, St. Paul's quadrant. And so we can see how these compounding and accumulating impacts from housing segregation to economic inequality, through educational inequality, all the way into environment and human health have this really devastating compounding impact that makes it so that we cannot simply say that segregation is something in the past that's part of our history. It is part of our history, but it is also absolutely part of our present. And so that leaves me to say, well, what should we do about it? And I actually have a lot of thoughts about what we should do about it. But I didn't prepare slides because this is usually the kind of what generates a lot of conversation. So I'll actually conclude here, and I'll ask and see if folks have questions, have thoughts, want to weigh in any way. And I'm happy to give my 2 cents or 3 or 4 on what I think we should be doing about it. But I also think that's something that we all need to think through together in terms of what we should do about it. So I'll stop there. I'll give my project's website one final plug. And I'll invite questions or comments. And I think Kalila is probably managing and moderating the chat. So thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much for that. That was a lot of really great information. I can definitely say that I learned a lot more about redlining, and especially around the representative language that was built into the construct and systems of how folks acquired land. So that was very informative. So we did have one question from Annie Evans came through about the making the slides available for classroom teachers, or if there's a way for classroom teachers to have access to your research to share with their students.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to make my slide deck public. I think this talk is being recorded. I'm not sure what y'all's intention is to make the recording public, but I'm absolutely happy to make my slide deck public or to share it with anyone in any way. So please feel free to reach out to me.
All right, awesome. So I have two questions coming in. From Dave Jenkins says, did you also look at the impact of local city segregation ordinances decades before redlining?
I have not, and I'm only now, like, we're moving into kind of phase 3 of the project. Phase 1 was a series of oral history interviews, participant-directed photography. I've then been doing lately, the last several months, doing a lot of spatial analysis. All the maps that I just showed you have been the more recent part of the project. And now I'm starting to work with historians and title abstractors to go back into the historical record on these kind of document searches. And so that's precisely where we're headed next, Dave. And if you know more about this and where these documents lie, I would absolutely love to chat with you and to follow up with you, or anyone else on this call for that matter. One thing that we're looking at that has been circulating has been it's not the case here locally, but in lots of cities, if you go to Zillow and go to the satellite view of the map, and you zoom in, you can oftentimes see the property lines of where property lines were in the past, where there are today, for example, interstate highways have been built across. And so we're starting to look through property records. We're starting to look through these old segregationist ordinances at the local and state level to try to like add some more. And of course, we're looking at all these racially restrictive covenants that are all over the historical record to build out that kind of historical archive. So thank you.
Yeah. All right. One more. It's a couple questions coming in. This is from Danielle Daca Felipe. I hope I pronounced that right. She asked, what do you feel would be the most effective policy interventions if the goal is to narrow the Black-white wealth gap, both at the local and national level?
Right. So this is the answer to that question is at the heart of this really amazing piece that was written a couple of years ago by Ta-Nehisi Coates in a cover story for The Atlantic called the Case for Reparations. And Ta-Nehisi Coates in that piece makes the argument essentially that this should be part of the basis for widespread reparations program in the US, is the erasure of Black wealth, or at the very least, the blocking of the construction of Black wealth across most of the 20th century through housing. Some proposals that I've seen kind of floated or talked about are, for example, down payment assistance, grants for Black home buyers. That is not loans, not low interest loans, but actual outright grants of tens of thousands of dollars per household towards the down payment of purchasing a home, for example. That's one program. In another, there's policies that have been suggested about property taxes, especially in the context of areas that are likely to gentrify in the future, which have rising property values can be a good thing, but they can also lead to rising property tax bills, which can have the impact of forcing out lower income populations from those areas. And so there's different ways that you can defer property tax increases until the property is sold, for example, rather than having to pay it year by year. So there's a lot of different policies, and economists and other kind of policy thinkers have thought a lot about all of these things. But the problem is there seems to politically, and this is in my opinion, there seems to politically be really limited appetite for putting kind of race at the center of any kind of public policy that would seek to redress some of these problems. And this is when I think of when I'm asked, if I can just zoom out a little bit and before we go on to the next question and say this question of like, well, what do we do about it? We can talk about all these different policies, but I think if we zoom out, one thing that we have to kind of conceptualize in how we think about the problem is that race was the center of how Black Americans were dispossessed of wealth for more than 100 years through housing policy. And to simply then now kind of say, well, we're not going to talk about race. We've entered a colorblind society and we're going to move forward treating everybody, quote unquote, equally, and kind of using this language of like colorblindness is deeply problematic because it erases the fact that race was at the center of a project to build white wealth and block the construction of Black wealth or block the accumulation of Black wealth. And to now turn around and say, well, now we need to take race out of the equation. So I think it's as much a kind of a policy question, what policies would increase Black wealth and decrease the racial wealth gap, but also how do we convince people to kind of on a political level to allow these very race-centric policies to move forward in a context where kind of colorblindness is the dominant discourse. Sorry, that was a long answer to maybe a more straightforward question. Sorry.
Very good. Let me get back into the chat. And folks, you also have the ability to unmute yourself. So you can unmute yourself and ask questions directly. Because there was one that came through from Dave Jenkins around, oh, there we go. Dave wanted to know, were African Americans blocked specifically from Virginia loans? And it sounds like the answer to that is yes, based on your presentation of what was in the FHA and things like that. But
yeah. I mean, so what I've done here in this talk, and in a lot of it looks at kind of the way that national policies played out at the local level. What I haven't spent as much time on and where I'm going in the future.
Oh, he clarified VA was Veterans Administration.
Yes, and yes, that is
Thank
also.
You, Dave.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, no, that is absolutely true. The Veterans Administration loans were also segregationist in nature during that same period. I was on a panel a week or two ago with Richard Rothstein, who's a well-known journalist writing about these issues, and he makes the point that especially in the 40s and 50s and into the early 60s, Black and white returning war veterans from World War II could have easily used VA and FHA loans to buy houses that were only twice national median income in places like Levittown. But in both cases, with FHA loans and with VA loans, only white homebuyers or potential white homebuyers were allowed to use those benefits to purchase those homes. So yeah, the VA policies were complicit in this as well.
Thank you. All right, one coming through from New Jurgen. What can be done about food deserts since box grocery stores don't seem to work in those areas? You had mentioned that the Save-A-Lot in that area in Norfolk had recently closed down.
Yeah, that's a great question because, and if you look up here in Newport News, I think a lot of the folks on this call are on the peninsula. There is the Piggly Wiggly right there in about Jefferson and 25th Street or so in Southeast Newport News. And before that, it was Jim's local market that also went out of business. And I know the city has worked really hard to keep a grocery store down in that food in the middle of that food desert. But at the end of the day, building a grocery store in the middle of a food desert doesn't solve the underlying problem of folks not having money to buy themselves kind of out of food insecurity. So simply putting a grocery store there doesn't solve the underlying problem, and oftentimes isn't isn't a long-term solution, because as we've seen in the case of Jim's Market in Newport News, and the case of the Save-A-Lot down here in St. Paul's, they go out of business and they don't find it profitable enough in the first place, and they shut down. They either go out of business or they shut down and leave anyway. And so I showed this map with the food deserts, not so much as to insinuate that building a grocery store is the solution, but more as this is the lack of food security and the lack of food availability is a symptom of the underlying problem. And this is an area of an incredible amount of really fascinating research going on right here, of the kind of the intersection of housing policy and of food insecurity. And I have to say, I don't have answers to it, but the food desert here isn't my argument with the food desert map isn't to say we should build more grocery stores in Berkeley and Compostela, but rather to say that this is a symptom of the long-term underlying problem.
Yeah, thank you for that. Danielle said snaps on your response, and thank you to that previous question, and asked she had a follow-up question where she's asking, what do you think would be necessary to shift the public lexicon to include race-conscious deep history and policy proposals?
Oh man, Danielle's putting me on the spot.
I know. I was like, that's a deep one.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is it has been encouraging especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, and especially in the wake of the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis, that is back in the news today as the trial starts in Minneapolis. I have been encouraged by the broader engagement, especially amongst people who maybe not previously weren't engaged, previously weren't thinking about these things, previously weren't thinking that these issues applied to them or were applicable to them in any way. So I think that perhaps, maybe I'm being naive or overly optimistic, but I think perhaps we're seeing the beginning of the ability to talk more directly about race and the extent to which our racist history manifests itself materially in the present day. So maybe precisely these kinds of discussions that we're having are part of the way to get to a place where they can be more a part of the discussion.
Yeah, beautiful. All right. We have a question from Annie Evans asking if urban farm markets like Tricycle in RVA or Food Justice Network in Charlottesville, could that be a piece of the solution, and how do we replicate those kinds of things in the Tidewater area?
Yeah, and I know, and I don't want to speak for other folks in the area who are doing this work, but there is a lot of work going on in thinking through kind of beyond the prototypical kind of capitalist relations in terms of food distribution, and beyond kind of typical kind of charity food distribution through things like food banks, of thinking about broader ways of kind of creating local food economies that involve farmers markets, that involve urban gardens. And so this has not been my area, my kind of my specialty in my research, but this is absolutely something that folks are working on and thinking about in this area. And I do know also that folks in this area are in communication with at least some of the groups in Richmond who are doing some of the really impressive work that's going on there.
Absolutely. And just as a note, Annie added that redlining is now going to be taught in schools as a part of SOL reasons, so will be in their curriculum. So.
Yeah, that's impressive. That's news to me. I didn't know that, Annie. Thanks for mentioning that.
Thanks for elevating that. All right, Dave sent me a direct message. Would you like me to read this? And linguistic moment, Annie, can you share what SOL means to everyone in the chat?
It's the state standards of learning.
Standards of learning.
All right, can y'all hear me?
I know, but I don't want to.
Yeah, sorry about that. This is Annie. Hi, Johnny.
Hey, Annie.
Yeah, so the standards are being revised K-12 if there are any parents out there, or teachers, I hope. We promote this event today through our teacher network, but the standards get revised every 7 years. by legislative demand, like they have to be revised. That's all content areas, not just social studies. But the governor had a special commission last year specifically to look at African American history, and redlining was included in the recommendations made to him and to the Board of Education. And the board did something that in my 31 years of teaching, they've never done before, which is they said, not only are we going to take your suggestions, but we're not going to wait to implement. Like they normally say they'll be implemented after July 1st, like other laws. They said on October 16th, these go into effect today. Mm-hmm. Teachers should start teaching this today. So that sent a huge message.
Yeah. Right? And that might, honestly, that might be part of how we can start moving beyond kind of this discourse of discourses of colorblindness and to kind of centering on race. And again, the material impacts in the present of our deeply problematic racial past, right?
Right. And Johnny knows, like, a big piece of what we've been doing with our networks that Johnny's a big part of is empowering students to have a voice in this. Like kids come up with great ideas and solutions for some of these problems, and they're going to be our future community leaders. So why not involve them now? So by embedding these in the standards, their science teachers can work on it, their history teachers, their English teachers, their math teachers, there'd be budgets involved. Like we try and make this interdisciplinary so kids start seeing that they can be part of the solution. And I'll be quiet now.
Thanks, Amy. No, that's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
I just wanted to add a quick comment if I could.
Yes.
Dave Jenkins.
Yes. Hi, Dave.
Hi. Basically, you know, thinking about all of this, my family was not rich coming up. And just to put it in perspective, like my grandparents were born in the 1890s. My folks were, my dad was born in 1921. So, basically, in their generations, they had this accumulation of poverty this accumulation of wealth that we've been talking about here. And if you were to talk to any of my parents about how they accumulated wealth, especially my dad, who was from the coal mining area of Western Maryland and grew up very poor, he would say, well, the way we got wealthy, Dave, is because we worked hard and we made good choices. And, you know, anybody out there in America could have made a choice we made. And I think that is very much the message that we've been getting from conservatives for the last 40 years in politics, that it all has to do with individual merit. And actually, at the same time, that they've been saying that government programs don't work. But in exploring my family's past and some of the untold family history, you see repeatedly where government played a role in our success. And granted, government won't do it by itself. It always takes people working hard for what they believe in. But there was a big leg up in my family from coming from poverty to the middle class. And it's very important that when we talk about moving forward and putting in some policies where government is going to be proactive in correcting racial injustice in this country, that white people like me and coming from backgrounds like mine understand that government programs are important, and government programs played a big part in our lives, and they can do that for others as well and do it very effectively.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks for sharing that. I could not have read that or said that better than you. So I'm glad that you came on and said that. I just want to thank Anne. I don't know if Anne is still on the call.
Yes, okay. I'm here to the last moment.
Okay, I just want to give her a shout out. She is a YMCA board member at our Tom and Ann Honeycutt YMCA in Newport News, and she is also a part of a work group that we are calling the Equity Builders. And she elevated Dr. John Finn and this topic to us as a part of our equity challenge, which is going on right now, and hopefully everyone has had an opportunity to sign the pledge and is receiving the daily activities. But just wanted to say thanks to Anne, uplift her, elevate her name. And this has been so rich of a discussion. And I know as community leaders and YMCA leaders, we can use this to inform, our decisions and how we engage in the communities that we are trying to serve. So Dr. Finn, any last parting words, or Anne?
I would just repeat my thanks to everyone for being here. And I'm about to put my email address in the chat. If anyone has any questions, to please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thanks very much to you, Kalila, and of course to Anne for setting this up. I appreciate it.
And really, I do want to, thank Kalila for your foundational organizational powers to make all of this happen. And then Johnny, really, this is probably about the fourth time over the past several years I've seen your work on this particular topic, and it just keeps getting richer and richer. You are just putting so much energy into uncovering all of this information and history and contemporaneity of what is happening. And it's inspiring, and we have a lot of work to do. And thank you for taking the time to share it with all of us.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Could I jump in with a couple more things? I'll make it really quick.
Okay, sure, Dave.
Okay. We talked about how urban centers are often 5 degrees warmer than surrounding areas. Just to put that in perspective, having worked in home building, if your electric bill is $100 more a month than it is somewhere else, that costs you over a period of 30 years, over $189,000, that family. So things like that will definitely, building more energy efficient homes or having programs like that will help us a great deal. One of the other things, again, coming from a white perspective in suburbia and looking at urban centers, and also having worked in home building, one of the things about neighborhoods is when you own a home in a neighborhood like the one I live in, where home values are going up, there's a great incentive to keep those homes really looking nice and do maintenance, because you have a solid investment. And in an area where property values are going down, it's very difficult to get a home equity loan if you need something fixed. And a lot of people would rightfully consider that almost money down the drain when they're spending it on their home maintenance. And so that's how we get some areas that look the way they do. So I just wanted to mention those couple other things.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dave.